Chairman Eitan, thank you for giving me the honor to present two very distinguished scholar practitioners of issues of the Near East and Islam, Professor Rabinovich and Dr. Neri. I'm going to introduce them just in a moment. This is a very sensitive session because we've moved from a full and scholarly analysis of the Sykes-Picot agreement to the implications of such agreement, the collapse of borders, a future perspective as it's written, lessons from other countries. Well, that's actually more of a provocative statement than we might think. What we ask ourselves after the first session is, when we look at the fragmentation of the Middle East, and specifically, the four countries that are, or states that are trotted out in this on this 100-year-old, maybe we'll call it a commemoration if it's not a celebratory anniversary, or what's happening in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Libya. And we ask the question about ungoverned spaces. What does it mean about governance? How are these states, these multi-ethnic, multi-religio, multinational, and territorial states going to actually conduct themselves? How are they going to govern themselves? And that's really, it's a very tough question. We heard the words condominium. We heard Professor Karsh talk about French and British mandated condominiums, confederations to serve their interest and control of entities and mini-states across the Middle East. But the question is, there's a real irony here. As Professor Dan Elazar, of blessed memory, wrote in his book, Federalism, the Way to Peace, that federalism in the West, in the United States, is the building block of civil society and a free collection of states in the United States, as well as in Europe. It's as European as bratwurst and sauerkraut, and American as apple pie. And yet, as Professor Elazar writes, when it came to the Middle East, the Westerners betrayed their own principles of society. And so we really ask the question, what kind of are federal arrangements as we understand them from other countries around the world, and specifically from the West, is that appropriate to consider as a model in any form when we look at these countries, as we look at a Middle East that's fragmenting and that is unraveling before our very eyes? What kinds of political models can we think about that might make sense? And let's be very careful about not superimposing, as the framers of the Sykes-Picot Agreement faithfully did, to impose Western mirroring, as Professor Bernard Lewis, a dear friend of Professor Rabinovich, has, by the way, talked about quite frequently during his illustrious 70-year career. Actually, Professor Lewis turns 100 next week, as his dear friend Professor Rabinovich knows. So with that as a very brief introduction, I will just say that the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and its founder, Professor Elazar, was thinking about these issues since 1976, since the center was founded 40 years ago. He was thinking about federalism and how it might work or might not work in the Middle East. This is one of his terrific books, and I really suggest that everyone take a look at it. Federalism and the Way to Peace, and One Land, Two Peoples, or his two great works on federalism or federal arrangements in the Middle East. Is it possible or not? It gives me really great pleasure, and it's really a treat, I think, for all of us, for two reasons. One, we have just two scholars on stage, which means that we can really enter into a much deeper type of analysis than when we have many people on the stage. And I'd like to introduce Professor Rabinovich and Dr. Neri, Dr. Jacques Neri. Professor Rabinovich really needs no introduction. Neither gentleman does, but I will anyway, just for the protocol. As many of you know, that Professor Rabinovich is Israel's former ambassador to the United States and former chief negotiator with Syria in the mid-1990s, and he's the former president of Tel Aviv University, which he was president for 8 years, and he currently is the president of the newly founded Israel Institute, which has offices in Washington and Jerusalem. And he's also professor emeritus of Middle Eastern History at Tel Aviv University, distinguished global professor at NYU in New York, distinguished fellow at the Brookings Institute Saban Center. Professor Rabinovich has also been a member of Tel Aviv University faculty since 1971. And he served as the Ettinger Professor of Contemporary History of the Middle East, Chairman of the Department of Middle East Studies, Director of the Dayan Center for Middle East and African Studies, Dean of Humanities, and Rector as well. He's the Vice Chairman of the INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies, which is the external institute of Tel Aviv University, and a Senior Research Fellow at the Dayan Center for Middle East Studies, co-editor of the center's new journal, Bastan. He's also the author of 6 books, if I'm correct, and really one of the world's great scholars and authorities on the Middle East, and with great focus on Syria. It's great to have you here, Professor Rabinovich. Professor Rabinovich is going to talk and give us a bit of a survey of his sense of what's happening here in the Middle East now, what models are possible, how we can think about incorporating political modeling from other examples around the world, and see if that is appropriate for us. And I'll just introduce Dr. Nuria, and then I'll ask Professor Rabinovich to start. Sitting to his right is a friend and a colleague, one of the great authorities on the Middle East as well in Israel, that's Colonel Dr. Jacques Nuria, who is a scholar with the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. He was the former senior advisor, diplomatic advisor to Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. He was also the chief analyst at Amman in the IDF Intelligence Corps. He's a graduate of Hebrew University. He has 3 degrees. He has a doctorate from Tel Aviv University, and he was Israel's defense and military attaché in France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. He speaks basically almost every language in the Middle East, including English, which is considered a language in the Middle East today. And he is really, he was actually born in Beirut and grew up there, so he has seen things from the inside out, not only from the outside in. Jacques, it's really a great honor to have you here with us on the podium. Professor Rabinovich, please welcome Professor Rabinovich, who will share his ideas with us now.
Thank you, and still good morning. It's a pleasure to share the podium with Jacques, who wrote his PhD with me. It was a political biography of Bashir Jumail, and was a member of the delegation I led for the negotiations with Syria in an effort to tinker with Sykes-Picot borders. And I will speak about the relationship between Sykes-Picot, the topic of the day, and the issue of stability or governance in the Middle East today. I cannot but begin with a couple of brief comments. First, about Sykes-Picot. Sykes-Picot, other than being a historic document and of course a very important milestone in shaping the map of the Middle East, became an item on the international diplomatic agenda in a number of ways more recently. For one thing, the former president of Syria, the father of the current ruler, namely Hafez al-Assad, one of his, he had two hobbies. One was when a major international figure arrived to see him for the first time, would be a US president, a US secretary of state, or the head of state, or prime minister, or foreign minister of another major country. He would hold a meeting somewhere between 6 and 8 hours, known in international diplomacy as the bladder test. And that long meeting would begin with somewhat of an hour or 2 hour lecture on the evils of Sykes-Picot. This is, in Hafez al-Assad's view, was the root of all evil. That is to say, the way in which the colonial powers drew the map of the Levant and parts of the Middle East. More recently, when the current set of development known briefly as the Arab turmoil began, people began to speak about the end of Sykes-Picot. Let's say with the collapse of the Syrian state, with the earlier collapse of the Iraqi state, given that Lebanon is actually another failed state, so 3 out of the 5 states that emerged from Sykes-Picot are failed states. Sykes-Picot collapsed. There was, and there still is, the prospect that there would be border changes. People spoke at the time, not so recently, but when the regime of Bashar al-Assad seemed on the verge of defeat before the Russian intervention, people spoke about the prospect of an Alawite secession from the Syrian state, and actually Syria's breakup or partition into a number of entities, a Alawite state in the west and northwest, maybe Hama, a pathway to the Shiite parts of Lebanon, a Kurdish autonomous or maybe a state in the northeast, a Druze entity in the south, and so forth and so forth. Iraq, of course, is de facto divided into 3 parts, and one of them, the Kurdish part, wants independence. The Kurds know very well that the Turks will not accept it, and others, like the United States and most of the Arab world, are also opposed to the breakup of the Iraqi state, but the real ambition that many Kurds have in Iraq and in a different way in Syria is to have an independent Kurdish entity, independent not just de facto but also de jure. And of course, for at least some of Iraq's Sunnis, given the fact that power was taken away from them after 4 centuries of hegemony, after the American invasion of 2003, and now that 20% Sunni Arabs of Iraq feel disenfranchised, some of them feel that their future lies not so much with the Iraqi state, but in some form of association with the Syrian state. And if we remove for a moment the radical or jihadi Islamist element from ISIS, remember ISIS is the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. This is how the name originated. So underlying that was the sense among quite a few Iraqi Sunnis that the future lies in some form of association with Syria's Sunnis rather than with the Iraqi Shiites and Kurds. And therefore the sense that a reshuffling of the cards in the greater Levant, that is to say the Levant and Iraq, was a realistic possibility, was in the air in the past few years. So the end of Sykes-Picot, question mark, which was the title of quite a few essays in the international media, was an expression of this turn of events. Also, if I may, a brief addition to the interesting presentation of the French case. Actually, the period that the French spent in Syria and Lebanon was, from their point of view, a mistake. France had no real interest in Syria and Lebanon. Britain had huge interest in this part of the world. Oil, road to stations on the road to India, the Suez Canal. There were very important imperial interests that Britain had in this part of the world, and Great Britain made a huge investment in a military campaign, huge losses during World War I, and it was here to implement real interest. The French had no real interest in Syria and Lebanon. There was this I would say feeble historic connection going back to François I, that was mentioned, but in terms of real interest, there were very few interests. But it was what people called imperialism of prestige. Say, at the end of this war, having paid such a dear price in terms of the German occupation of much of France and the very costly campaign to liberate France itself from German occupation, France wanted to emerge from the war with something. And secondly, the one thing the French could not tolerate was that the British rivals would walk away with a huge booty in the Middle East, and France would remain empty-handed. And therefore, it insisted on getting its share in the Levant, let's say what we call Syria and Lebanon. It was a very unhappy experience. Even Lebanon, where the Catholic Maronite population was pro-French, it ended on a sour note during and in the aftermath of World War II. The French were expelled from both Syria and Lebanon, and that made a huge investment with very little to show for. But of course, they were an important partner in shaping what we call the Sykes-Picot order in the Levant. Now, how is this related to instability, to the collapse of these and other states? I said, these are not the only failed state in the Middle East. So is Yemen, so is Sudan, and so is Libya. They have nothing to do with Sykes-Picot. Their collapse has to do with a larger crisis in the Middle East and in the Arab world in recent years. But the collapse of states like Iraq, Syria, de facto Lebanon has to do with Sykes-Picot and has to do with the policy that was pursued by the British and the French in the aftermath of Sykes-Picot. And as Professor Kash said correctly, much actually happened in the aftermath of Sykes-Picot that sometimes ran contrary to Sykes-Picot and it was not necessarily derivative of Sykes-Picot. For instance, the British-French trade of Mosul to the British area that eventually was included in the Iraqi state. The British wanted Mosul with the oil, and the deal was, you give us Mosul and we give you a free hand in Syria. Okay, so the British ended with Mosul and the oil, but Iraq became a very diverse state. It now was a state that had three distinct blocks, let's say the 60% Sunni Arab, 20% Shia Arab, 20% Sunni Arabs, 20% Kurds who were Sunnis but not Arabs. Now, Mosul could, the whole area may very well have been given to the Turkish state, but of course the British wanted the oil-rich area for themselves. The result was this hybrid country that they called Iraq. It was followed by a British decision to keep the Sunni hegemony in Iraq. The Ottomans gave the Sunnis hegemony in Iraq because the area of Iraq was a border area between the Sunni Ottoman Empire and the Shiite Persian empires, and they wanted loyal rulers in Iraq, and therefore they relied on the Sunnis. The British perpetuated that. Names that evoke romantic memoirs like Gertrude Bell and this group of British policymakers on the ground were supportive of that, and they also imported Prince or King Faisal, who was removed by the French from Syria, and compensated him with the kingdom of Iraq. That is to say, they put a distinctively Sunni dynasty at the head of this state and perpetuated the hegemony of the Sunnis that only came to an end after the American invasion in 2003. Now, what did the French do with the area that was given to them? So they divided it into Syria and Lebanon. They made a capital mistake by expanding the territory of Lebanon because they felt that Lebanon was loyal to them. That's a place they could rely on, and therefore wrongly assumed that Lebanon would become more viable and a better base by expanding its territory. The architect of French policy in the Levant was a man called Robert Dequet, who was one of the leaders of the French colonial lobby. Interestingly, I open brackets, the papers, the archive of Robert Dequet are kept in the eastern provinces of Canada. Remember de Gaulle standing in Montreal and speaking about our French-speaking brothers. So if you're a French colonialist or imperialist, Eastern Canada is an area I think fondly about, and Decay left his papers in Fredericton in Eastern Canada. So Decay was the architect of French policy in Syria and Lebanon, so one major mistake was to expand Lebanon, together, of course, in alliance with some Maronite leaders of the Maronite Church. And this is, of course, a lesson to be learned by others in the Middle East, that just by acquiring additional territory populated by other people, you don't necessarily enhance your durability and stability. Because what happened over time was that the Christians lost their majority in Lebanon. The last census, as we all know, was held in 1932. It still showed a majority of 6-5 Christians over Muslims. That was almost a century ago, no longer relevant. Second, the French decided not to create one Syrian state because they recognized that the dominant force politically at least in Syria cities, was Arab nationalism. Arab nationalism in French eyes was identified with British policy, and they felt that if they allow a Syrian state dominated by Arab nationalism to be established, they would play into the hands of the British rivals. And therefore they decided on divide and rule. Also were in a way acting tongue-in-cheek with regard to President Wilson, who introduced the notion of self-determination into the peace settlement post-World War I. And what they said cynically to Wilson said, you want self-determination, you'll get plenty of self-determination. Alawites, Druze, Kurds, they will all get self-determination. We will create statelets. A statelet of the Alawites, a statelet of the Druze, autonomy to the Kurds in the northeast, and a special regime to the province of Alexandretta in the northwest that eventually in 1939 was ceded away to Turkey. It was only in 1925 that the states of Aleppo and Damascus were allowed to be consolidated into what was called the state of Syria, and it was only in 1945 when the French were expelled by the British and the Americans from Syria, that all these territories were amalgamated into one Syrian state, dominated by Arab nationalist parties. But these Arab nationalist parties came to rule over a very fragmented country with a strong tradition of local autonomy and a couple of ticking bombs. One such ticking bomb was the fact that the Syrian army was composed largely of minority officers and NCOs because the French did not trust Sunni Arabs, and they recruited to the auxiliary force in the Levant from the minorities, Alawites, Druze, Ismailis, Armenians, and so forth. So the Syrian army was an army populated by minorities, and add to this the fact that the Ba'ath Party, which was a secularist party that wanted to create a common platform for everyone in Syria, was attractive to minorities, and therefore in 1963, after a coup d'etat that was staged by Alawite and Druze Ba'athi officers, Alawites and Druze came to dominate Syria, and in time, the Alawites got rid of the Druze, and what we have had in the past few decades is a country controlled by a minority that has about 12% of the population and is regarded by the Sunni Muslim majority as not properly Muslim. So, in other words, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq were built ab initio on very shaky foundations. So much so that Syria in 1958 was actually willing to give up its independent existence and merge itself with Egypt into the United Arab Republic that lasted 3.5 years and actually had a salutary effect on a sense of Syrian entity, because living in the shadow of a much larger Egypt, Syrians began to feel Syrian, and therefore they seceded from Egypt, re-established the Syrian state that Hafez al-Assad, when he took power in 1970, built into actually a powerful state seeking hegemony in its immediate environment and becoming a very important regional and international actor. So, point number one, Sykes-Picot in the broad sense of the term, not just the Sykes-Picot agreement, but the whole set of agreements and actions taken by the British and the French after World War I left this part of the world with states built on shaky foundations. There's one exception that, of course, will become relevant to our discussion later, and that is Jordan. Because in theory, if you want to ask what is the most artificial entity that came out of the Sykes-Picot period, it's Jordan. And, it was mentioned before. Prince Abdallah, Emir Abdallah, was very unhappy with his and his family's fate with the British, the way the British treated them, and took his Bedouin and began to march towards Damascus. Churchill stopped him in his tracks and said, wait, we'll get your own entity, and that was the principality, the emirate of Transjordan, that eventually became the kingdom of Transjordan, the kingdom of Jordan with the annexation of the West Bank after the Israeli War of Independence. So there could not be something more artificially created, and there were no historic roots. I mean, the Lebanese entity had historic roots. Syria and Iraq were names with an older history, not necessarily in the same borders, but Jordan was artificial, and yet it is the most stable of all of these entities. And when we speak about the question of what can guarantee some stability in this region, we'll talk about the source of stability in Jordan. Okay, so having pinned some of the responsibility for the current crisis on the architects of Sykes-Picot, we now need to say that this is obviously not the only reason for the current instability and the collapse of several states in the region. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about another, which is the dominance for many decades of the notion of Arab nationalism. Arab nationalism is really, in the version of pan-Arab nationalism, departs from the assumption that all Arabs are members of the same nation, that that nation should be united into one entity. There should be one great Arab state that would enable the Arabs to emerge from the crisis of modernity and would give the Arabs their proper place under the sun. The ideology of pan-Arab nationalism was brought to a heyday during the days of Abdul Nasser, because the most powerful Arab state became the base. It had a charismatic messianic leader, and these were the heyday years of pan-Arab nationalism, but pan-Arab nationalism then began to decline. Now, what was, in a way, the problem with Arab nationalism? Arab nationalism is actually a Sunni movement. It's a movement with a Sunni tincture. It's not, doesn't say so. Every formal definition of Arabism and Arab nationalism doesn't mention denominations and so forth, but de facto it's a Sunni movement. So in countries where Arab nationalism had sway, it was expressed the dominance of Sunni Arabs, and Arabs who were minority Arabs, could be Shiite, could be Christian, could be Druze, could be Ismailis, felt actually that they were deprived. They were not full members of the political entity, something that we know from other parts of the world. If you think about Jews and other minorities in Eastern Europe or in Central Europe, they always tended to adopt radical ideologies in order to transform the basis of society and the basis of the political entity so that they could be equal partners. This is why we found so many Jews and other minoritarians in the communist parties of Russia itself and Eastern Europe. So minorities in this part of the Middle East tended to act according to similar rules. But the dominance of Arab nationalism militated against the creation of pluralistic political systems. that because the notion of a minority, a community, and an entity, a sub-national entity, was an anathema to Arab nationalism. The word for a community is taifa in Arabic. Taifiyya is what we call in Hebrew adatiyut, and taifiyya is a very pejorative term in Arabic. So somebody who is accused of taifiyya is somebody who commits a crime against Arab nationalism. And therefore, the quest for a pluralistic political system, one that would recognize the differences between the communities that make up the nation or the political community that inhabits a country, was a problem. There was one exception, that was Lebanon. The Lebanese political system that was built by the French was the only system that recognized the fact that people's ultimate allegiance was not given to the Lebanese state or to Arab nationalism, but to their communities. And therefore, power was distributed in what we call a consociational democracy in Lebanon, and it functioned quite well for 30 years, from 1945 to 1975, and then collapsed with the outbreak of the Lebanese civil war and has not been restored yet. But countries like Syria, Iraq, have refused to recognize the plural nature of the society and pretended that everybody is an Arab, which was a major problem. So the influence of Arab nationalist ideology and its lingering impact to the present has been a problem. And of course, other factors. We don't have time to get into the whole set of processes that led to instability and collapse. They happened on all three levels of politics in the Middle East. Internationally, there was a certain stability produced by the Cold War that ended. There was a period of American hegemony. America, as we all know and read, is in a way, at least under Obama, wants to walk away from the Middle East, and there is a sense of abandonment, a vacuum is being filled, at least in Syria, by Russia, and that doesn't lead to any stability. Regionally, the old order of regional politics, as we knew it, system of inter-Arab relations, at the core of regional politics, is hardly relevant. The Middle East is now different. Two large, powerful states have rejoined it, Turkey and Iran. And if people used to equate the Middle East with the Arab world a few years ago, it's no longer the case. The regional system is governed by a conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia, oftentimes equated with the conflict between Sunnis and Shia. And of course, this undermines stability, as does Iran's quest for a regional hegemony. And thirdly, just look at the UN development report of 2003 and the other editions written by Arab intellectuals explaining the ills of Arab society and Arab political system. This finally came to a head. Of course, Islamic resurgence and the challenge put by both Islamist and jihadi movements to the order. The result is the current chaos and collapse. And so what can we do? So one important development that can happen, will not happen before the spring of 2017, after the American elections and after a new administration comes into power, a return of the United States to the role that only the United States can play as the external power that oversees developments and helps steer them in the right direction. Secondly, and here we come back to what Mr. Dijker said about federalism, Syria and Iraq can be put together again, but there'll have to be some form of a federal system, because the Kurds, Sunnis and Shias in Iraq will not live in a centralized unitary state. They would all want to enjoy virtual autonomy in their areas, and the state will have to adopt some form of federalism. It's going to be much more difficult in Syria because we don't have that neat distinction and geographical distribution between the minority groups, but a system that allows for a great deal of local autonomy and would recognize the plural nature of the country. We'll have to emerge, not right away, it's not ripe for it anytime soon, but if we look beyond the horizon, possibly yes. I should underline that there's a great resistance in the Arab world to border changes, to reshuffling of the cards. Even in countries like Egypt, that seems quite secure in its own coherence and is removed physically from our area, the sense is that if you remove one brick from the wall, the whole wall will collapse, and they would resist border changes. The countries, probably the tendency would be to keep the current frameworks, but to rebuild the political systems in these countries in order to accommodate the diverse nature of the population and to allow for the gradual construction of a normal